Christopher Miller sat at his desk, his fingers resting quietly on the mechanical keyboard. He had spent 3 decades working in systems engineering, starting right after his discharge from the Navy in 1994. He had served as a submarine reactor technician, a job where a single mistake could mean a catastrophe hundreds of feet beneath the ocean's surface. On a submarine, there was no room for error, and procedures were followed with absolute discipline. That experience had taught him to appreciate systems that were built on strict, unforgiving procedures. In his 30 years of civilian work, he had maintained that same philosophy. Some processes simply could not be rushed, and some rules could not be bent. He believed that compliance was the foundation of safety, and that shortcuts were the first step toward disaster. He remembered the cold, metallic smell of the submarine's reactor compartment, where every seal and valve had to be inspected daily. The transition to a civilian office, with its carpeted floors and fluorescent lights, had been strange at first, but the underlying principles of engineering remained the same. In both worlds, you did not ignore warnings and you did not skip steps. It was exactly 11:15 on a quiet Wednesday morning when Gregory Lawson walked up to his desk. Gregory was the vice president of digital operations, a position he had held for 14 months. At 34 years old, Gregory possessed a Master of Business Administration degree from Columbia University and 8 years of consulting experience. He dressed in expensive suits and checked his luxury watch constantly, always acting as if his time was far more valuable than anyone else's in the building. Gregory did not offer a greeting. He simply crossed his arms and stared down at the screen. He looked like a man who believed that leadership was about giving orders and expecting immediate obedience, without regard for the practical challenges involved. He spent his days talking about strategic alignment and operational velocity, but he lacked the patience to understand how the database was structured. He told Christopher to shut down his workstation and leave the building immediately. Christopher looked up, keeping his expression neutral. He knew the significance of his workstation. It was the only terminal in the entire company configured with the secure, encrypted authentication token that allowed a direct connection to their primary defense client's satellite monitoring feed. This single contract was worth $3,200,000 annually, representing a significant portion of the company's revenue. More importantly, it funded the salaries of 180 employees. For Christopher, the contract was also his personal safety net, ensuring he could retire in 2 years and fulfill his promise to his daughter Sarah Miller to pay half of his grandson Jake Miller's college tuition. Jake was a sophomore studying engineering at the State University, and Sarah had recently sent several messages expressing anxiety about the upcoming payment deadline. The tuition cost was $6,400 per semester, which was a large sum for a single parent working as a teacher. Christopher had assured Sarah that he would handle his share, but that promise was contingent on his continued employment. Christopher asked Gregory if he wanted a simple session log out or a complete system shutdown. Gregory sneered, adjusting his tie. He told Christopher not to overcomplicate the matter and demanded a complete shutdown immediately. Christopher could have explained the consequences of such an action. He could have mentioned that the client's secure protocols required a 72-hour authentication cycle to reconnect any terminal that disconnected improperly. He could have pointed out that he had sent 4 separate compliance memos detailing this exact issue over the last 8 months. But working under Gregory for over a year had taught him that the young executive did not value technical explanations. Gregory had once told him that his insistence on following legacy protocols was holding back digital transformation. He wanted agile operators, not debaters who got caught up in regulations. So Christopher did not argue. He turned back to his screen and initiated the shutdown sequence. He watched as the progress bar crept forward, severing the live data feed and terminating the secure processes. It took 90 seconds to dismantle the connection he had personally designed and maintained since the security overhaul in 2003. When the screen went black and the cooling fans quieted, Christopher opened the system audit log from his secondary admin console. He typed a clean, factual entry. stating that the client monitoring feed was terminated per management instruction. Noting the time as exactly 11:17 in the morning, Gregory told him to leave his security badge on the desk. Christopher unclipped the plastic badge and set it down next to his favorite coffee mug, which bore the name of his former submarine, the USS Pittsburgh. He asked if he was expected back later that day. Gregory smiled, a condescending expression that suggested he had won a long-running battle. He told Christopher to take the rest of the day off and claimed he had the situation handled. He walked away, already typing on his mobile phone. Christopher knew Gregory was likely messaging the chief executive officer, Timothy Walsh, to boast about how he had finally removed the old-school engineer, who was slowing down progress. Christopher packed his laptop into his bag, picked up his Navy mug, and stood up. The office around him hummed with its usual noise. A few rows over, Danielle Foster, a junior systems analyst, looked up from her cubicle. She had been watching the interaction, her eyes wide with concern. Danielle was a smart young engineer who reminded Christopher of himself when he first started his career. She understood the complexity of their infrastructure, but she lacked the seniority to challenge executive decisions. Christopher gave her a small nod, then walked toward the elevators. He had no intention of going home just yet. He wanted to see how the afternoon would unfold. He knew that the system would not remain silent for long, and he wanted to be nearby when the consequences arrived. Christopher took the elevator down to the ground floor and walked into the small cafe located near the building's main entrance. The cafe had large glass windows that offered a clear view of the lobby. He found a quiet table in the corner and ordered a black coffee. The waitress, Beatrice, had worked there for 5 years and knew his routine. She brought his coffee quickly and asked if he was having a difficult day. Christopher smiled and said it was about to become interesting. He pulled out his personal mobile device and checked the status page for the client monitoring feed. The status indicator was a solid dark gray, showing that the system was offline. He sat by the window and sipped his coffee, letting the minutes pass. He knew that the Department of Defense compliance audit was scheduled to begin at 5 o'clock that evening. The client's security team would attempt to connect to the feed to verify compliance with national security standards. Specifically, they would be auditing their adherence to National Institute of Standards and Technology Special Publication 800-171, which governed the protection of controlled unclassified information in non-federal systems. When they found the feed was dark, the consequences would be immediate. The contract allowed for penalties of $15,000 per day for unexplained outages during audit windows, and a clause allowed the client to terminate the agreement entirely if security protocols were violated. Christopher calculated the potential loss to the company, realizing that a prolonged outage could lead to bankruptcy. About 45 minutes after Christopher had sat down, he saw Gregory walk back into the lobby from his lunch. Gregory was walking with a relaxed, confident stride, carrying a paper bag from a nearby sandwich shop. He looked like a man who believed he had successfully modernized the department by removing a stubborn obstacle. However, Gregory's relaxed demeanor vanished the moment he saw the two women waiting near the reception desk. Carol Matthews, the chief operating officer, stood with her arms crossed, her expression grim. Next to her was Laura Rodriguez, the client's senior procurement officer. Laura had driven 2 hours from the client's operations facility, and her posture indicated that she was not there for a routine visit. As Gregory approached, Carol spoke to him, pointing toward the elevators. Laura held up her tablet, showing Gregory a screen that Christopher knew must be displaying the system outage alert. Even from a distance, Christopher could see Gregory's face lose its color. His hands began to move in wide defensive gestures as he attempted to explain the situation. Carol did not look interested in his excuses. She turned and led the group toward the elevators, with Gregory scrambling to keep up. Christopher finished his coffee, left a tip for Beatrice, and took the elevator back up to his department. When he stepped onto the floor, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The usual office chatter had stopped, replaced by quiet whispers. Employees were leaning over their desks, pretending to work while trying to gather information. Christopher walked back to his desk and set his laptop down. Danielle Foster immediately got up from her seat and walked over, holding a clipboard to look as if she was discussing a project. She told Christopher that the entire system was in chaos. She said Gregory, Carol, and Laura were currently in the server room, and that the IT support technician, George Foster, had been summoned to assist. Danielle said she had heard Gregory arguing that the outage was a minor technical glitch that could be resolved in a few minutes. Christopher thanked her for the update and told her to remain focused on her tasks. He knew that the technical staff was nervous, as many of them had families to support and bills to pay. A few minutes later, George Foster walked past Christopher's desk. George was a veteran IT technician who had been with the company for 15 years. He looked exhausted. He stopped briefly and whispered to Christopher that the executives were asking if they could restore the authentication state from a virtual machine backup. George had told them that the security tokens were hardware-bound and could not be cloned or restored, meaning a full re-authentication was the only option. He asked Christopher if he was going to intervene. Christopher replied that he had not been asked to help yet. He sat at his desk, opened his terminal, and waited for the phone to ring. He knew that in corporate life, timing was everything, and intervening too early would only allow Gregory to shift the blame. He wanted Gregory to confront the reality of the situation without any safety net. It did not take long. At exactly 1:30 in the afternoon, the phone on Christopher's desk rang. It was Carol's extension. She asked him to come to conference room B immediately. Christopher gathered his notepad and walked down the hallway. When he entered the room, the tension was thick. Carol sat at the head of the table, her laptop open, and a yellow legal pad covered in notes in front of her seat. Laura Rodriguez sat opposite her, looking calm but resolute. George Foster stood near the projector screen, which was displaying the system topology map. Gregory Lawson was pacing near the whiteboard, his suit jacket removed and his shirt damp with sweat. Carol asked Christopher to sit down and explain the timeline of the morning's events. Christopher opened his notepad and spoke in a calm, measured voice. He stated that at 11:15, Gregory had ordered him to shut down his workstation. He explained that he had asked Gregory twice to confirm if he wanted a complete shutdown, noting that a full shutdown would terminate the secure feed. Christopher stated that Gregory had confirmed the instruction both times, telling him to stop overcomplicating things. He then pointed to the screen, where George had pulled up the audit log. The entry from 11:17 clearly showed the system shutdown, logged under Gregory's direct authority. Gregory stopped pacing and pointed an accusing finger at Christopher. He admitted that he had ordered the shutdown, but argued that Christopher had failed to explain the full scope of the risks. He claimed that as the technical expert, Christopher had an obligation to prevent him from making a decision that would damage the company. He argued that Christopher had stayed silent out of spite, wanting to see him fail. Gregory looked at the other managers, trying to find any sign of agreement, but the room remained silent. Christopher remained calm. He reached into his folder and pulled out a stack of documents. He placed them on the table. He stated that he had sent Gregory a detailed, 8-page memo 8 months ago, explaining the 72-hour authentication cycle and the NIST compliance requirements. He then showed a copy of the presentation slides from the quarterly security review in February, where he had highlighted the risks of a single point of failure and the consequences of an improper shutdown. Finally, he presented an email exchange from July, where he had explicitly warned Gregory that consolidating terminal access without maintaining a secondary active node would violate federal regulations. Christopher noted that Gregory had signed the attendance sheet for the February review, which was archived in the HR training files. Laura Rodriguez leaned forward, her eyes scanning the documents Christopher had provided. She looked at Gregory and stated that the outage was not just a technical issue, but a direct violation of their contract security requirements. She explained that under Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement Clause 252.204-70012, their company was required to provide continuous, real-time monitoring of the satellite ground links. By shutting down the terminal, they had failed to maintain the required security posture during a federal audit window. She stated that the Department of Defense compliance team had already logged the failure and that she would be filing an official incident report. She demanded a formal, written explanation from Gregory by 5 o'clock that evening, explaining why a critical system had been powered down without authorization. Gregory looked at Carol, pleading for support. He argued that he had been hired to modernize the infrastructure and that some disruption was inevitable during a transition. Carol did not look sympathetic. She told Gregory that modernization did not include violating federal regulations or ignoring written warnings from senior staff. She stated that the company was now facing $15,000 in daily penalties and the potential loss of a $3,200,000 contract that supported 180 families. She turned to Christopher and asked how long it would take to restore the feed. Christopher explained that the authentication cycle would require at least 72 hours. They would need to generate a new token package, submit it to the client security officer, and run validation tests. The earliest the feed could be online was Friday evening, assuming the client's security team cooperated immediately. Carol instructed Christopher to coordinate the restoration effort directly with the client's team and to copy her on all communications. She then looked at Gregory and told him to meet her in her office in 15 minutes. The meeting was adjourned. Christopher gathered his documents, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction that his preparation had paid off. As the others left the room, Gregory walked over to Christopher, who was gathering his documents. Gregory's face was red and his voice was low and threatening. He told Christopher that he had made a significant enemy. He warned Christopher that he was only 2 years away from retirement and that he would make sure those 2 years were the most difficult of his career. Gregory claimed that he still had the support of Harold Barnes, the chief financial officer, and that he would not be pushed out easily. He told Christopher that technical staff were replaceable, but executives were not. Christopher looked at Gregory, keeping his voice calm and steady. He stated that in his Navy career, he had worked on systems where a mistake meant loss of life. He had learned to respect protocols because they kept people safe, not because they were convenient. He told Gregory that the audit log was an objective record that did not care about corporate politics or personal threats. He picked up his folder and walked out of the room, leaving Gregory standing alone by the whiteboard. He knew that Gregory's threats were born of desperation and he refused to let them affect his work. Christopher went back to his desk and began the restoration process. He contacted Nina Phillips, the client's security officer. Nina was a former military cybersecurity specialist who had been the one to insist on the strict single-custody terminal access rules. When Christopher explained the situation, Nina was angry about the outage but appreciated Christopher's prompt communication. She sent over the token generation utility and the necessary validation checklists. Christopher worked with Danielle Foster, walking her through each step of the process. He wanted to ensure that she understood the system completely, knowing that she would eventually need to manage it after his retirement. They spent hours running integrity checks and verifying that the encryption keys were correctly aligned. By mid-afternoon, Carol called Christopher into her office. The office was quiet, and Carol looked tired. She told Christopher that the chief executive officer, Timothy Walsh, was flying back early from a business trip and would be in the office the next morning. Timothy was extremely angry about the situation and wanted to know how a single executive could disable a critical defense link. Carol asked Christopher if he was absolutely certain that the documentation would hold up under scrutiny. She explained that if the company lost the contract, they would have to lay off a large portion of the department, and the company's reputation in the defense sector would be ruined. Christopher assured her that the record was complete. He had already compiled a digital folder containing every email, memo, and meeting note related to the workstation security. He had sent the folder to Sandra Clark, the Human Resources Director, who was preparing the official incident file for the board of directors. Christopher explained that the documentation proved Gregory had been warned repeatedly about the 72-hour lockout and the DFAR's compliance rules, but had chosen to proceed anyway. Carol nodded, expressing her appreciation for his thoroughness. She told him that she would handle the executive communications and that he should focus on the technical restoration. Later that evening, Christopher received a confirmation email from Sandra Clark. She thanked him for the thorough organization of the files, noting that the documentation was exactly what was needed to establish clear responsibility. Christopher closed his laptop, packed his bag, and left the office. He felt a sense of relief. He had done his job, documented his warnings, and followed the procedures. The rest was out of his hands. He thought about his grandson, Jake, hoping that this situation would not affect his ability to help with the college tuition. He was determined to protect his retirement, and he knew that his documentation was his strongest shield. He felt confident that the truth would prevail in the morning meeting. The next morning, the large conference room was packed. Timothy Walsh, the chief executive officer, sat at the head of the table. Carol Matthews sat to his right, and Sandra Clark sat to his left. George Foster had set up the projector to show the system validation logs. Laura Rodriguez was present on the video screen, joined by Nina Phillips. Gregory Lawson sat at the far end of the table, looking pale but attempting to maintain his composure. He had brought a leather portfolio and had dressed in a formal suit, likely hoping that a professional appearance would help his case. Timothy Walsh opened the meeting by stating that the company's relationship with its primary defense client was in serious jeopardy. He asked Carol to present the findings of the internal investigation. Carol referred to the timeline and the system logs. She showed that Christopher had executed the shutdown only after receiving direct, repeated orders from Gregory. She then pointed to the documents Christopher had provided, which were displayed on the screen. The emails and memos clearly showed that Gregory had been warned about the 72-hour lockout and the federal compliance regulations. Gregory attempted to defend himself. He argued that the technical terms used in the memos were confusing and that Christopher had not made the operational risks clear. He claimed that he was trying to improve efficiency and reduce the company's reliance on a single operator. He argued that the situation was a communication failure and that the responsibility should be shared between the management and the technical team. Gregory suggested that they should implement a new training program to prevent similar issues in the future. Rather than focusing on individual blame, Sandra Clark, the Human Resources Director, spoke next. She stated that she had reviewed the meeting notes and the signed attendance sheets from the February quarterly review. She explained that the documentation was clear and unambiguous. Gregory had signed the sheets, confirming that he had attended the training sessions where the workstation protocols were explained. In addition, the email logs showed that Gregory had replied to Christopher's July warning with a message telling to focus on execution rather than debating policies. Sandra stated that Gregory's actions constituted a clear breach of fiduciary duty, as he had ignored established compliance rules and put a major contract at risk. Timothy Walsh looked at Gregory. He stated that leadership required taking responsibility for decisions, especially when those decisions had negative consequences. He explained that Gregory's actions had exposed the company to significant financial penalties and had damaged their reputation with the Department of Defense. Timothy stated that the company could not afford to retain executives who ignored federal regulations, and Chen's attempted to blame their staff for their own mistakes. He announced that Gregory was being placed on immediate administrative leave and that his employment would be terminated at the conclusion of the formal review. He instructed Sandra to coordinate the collection of Gregory's company property and to revoke his network access immediately. Gregory stood up, his face pale and his hands shaking. He looked around the table, but nobody would meet his eye. He closed his portfolio and walked out of the conference room. A few minutes later, 2 security guards escorted him from the building. He was left to contemplate the consequences of his actions alone. The door closed behind him with a soft click, marking the end of his short and turbulent tenure at the company. Timothy then turned to Christopher. He thanked him for his thorough documentation and his professional handling of the situation. He stated that the company needed leaders who respected regulations and understood the importance of compliance. Timothy announced that Christopher was being promoted to Vice President of Infrastructure Security, effective immediately. In this new role, Christopher would oversee all compliance protocols for the company's defense contracts and would ensure that all staff were properly trained. Christopher accepted the promotion, stating that he would work to ensure the system remains stable and secure. He knew that the responsibility was great, but he felt prepared to handle it. By Friday afternoon, Christopher and Danielle Foster had successfully completed the validation tests. Nina Phillips verified the new security tokens, and the monitoring feed was restored to service. The client confirmed that the connection was stable, and the compliance audit was rescheduled for the following week. The company had avoided the termination of the contract, and the daily penalties were waived due to their prompt response and complete transparency. 3 months later, Christopher was sitting in his new office, looking over the training manuals he had developed with Danielle. He had 18 months left until his retirement, and his new salary ensured that he could easily cover Jake's college expenses without touching his primary savings. He had heard that Gregory had found a position at a small financial technology startup, but the company had folded after only 8 months. Gregory had sent him a message on a professional networking site asking for a job reference. Christopher had deleted the message without replying. He knew that some systems did not forgive shortcuts, and some lessons had to be learned the hard way. He was content knowing that he had built a legacy of integrity, reliability, and respect for the rules.